I'm Gabriel Filippelli. I'm a professor of earth sciences at IUPUI, and much of my work focuses on environmental justice issues. Now, environmental justice issues fall across a range of sectors, including my own work here locally in Indianapolis on environmental justice around lead exposure, so differential lead exposure. We certainly see from public health data that low-income communities of color exhibit significantly higher rates of lead poisoning than do more affluent communities. Much of this is driven, we find, by differential rates of exposure to lead. And lead is present now, this legacy lead is present now in soils and dust. And the exposure rates are just significantly higher for those low-income communities of color. So they disproportionately bear the burden of past lead contamination. Well, this also extends, these environmental justice issues also extend to climate change. And here is an area of research that is increasingly important now and in the future, where we need to understand the intersections between race, income inequality, and climate change, and try to counteract that so we can turn environmental injustice to environmental justice. I have a relatively long history of this relationship related to climate change. I was a Peace Corps volunteer on a small island nation in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Kiribati. Kiribati gained independence from the British in 1979 after the Brits had basically exploited and completely depleted the supplies of minerals that they were mining out of some of the islands. These are phosphate minerals. Even in the early days, I was there from 1987 to 1989. The nation was already concerned about climate change. This was the same interval where James Hansen famously presented in congressional testimony the first real national view on climate change and its risks. Yet in Kiribati, they were well ahead of that. And you know why? It's because they were realizing that they were going to become the first victims of climate change on a national scale. So just to put this in context a little bit, this is a nation, an island nation that spans about 16 small islands. It has a total population of 100,000 people. They lived on these islands for at least 2,000 years. They have a long history. They have their own language, the Tateni Kiribati. They have their own cultures and traditions. And they have collectively contributed almost nothing to climate change. My carbon emissions in a given week surpass some of these, the individual islands' carbon emissions for an entire year, and I'm just one person. So when we were in Kiribati, one of the concerns there about climate change was rising sea levels. So with melting of ice sheets and thermal expansion of the oceans just from heating, sea level was going up slightly, even back then. And the concern was not so much that sea level would rise and wash over and inundate their island, although they were having some problems with this, with major storms that would destroy parts of the island. But it was more concerned with their drinking water supply. These island nations are like narrow strips, these small islands, or atolls. And so when rain fell from above, whatever landed on the actual solid bit of atoll was collected in this small plume of water, this little freshwater lens underneath the island. It's pretty precarious, and so during times of drought, for example, this lens would shrink, right? And sometimes some of the wells would go brackish around them, making them undrinkable. But the problem with sea level rise is it increased the pressure of salt water into this very precarious freshwater lens. And so we were already seeing in the southern part of the island that I was stationed on, for example, one of the villages, they had lost almost all of their wells because it was right on the edge of the atoll. So they were getting pressure from three sides. Well, one might say that to respond to that, well, why don't they just drink bottled water, or why don't they desalinate the water? Well, none of these are options for a country and islands that not only have no running water or electricity for most of the islands, but they don't even get a boat resupply service, maybe more than once a month. And so, in anticipation of the continued horrors of climate change, the country had already purchased land off island, so in Fiji, in Australia, to relocate. So, if you want to think in a global sense, the first victims of climate injustice will be some of these small island nations that contributed nothing to climate change and yet will be the greatest victims. Now, we can come a little bit closer and also see these issues. In the US, for example, a lot of the coastal communities in the US that are most vulnerable to hurricane damage and storm surge damage tend to be also lower income communities of color. Why is that? Well, the wealthier communities, for example, those ridiculous condominium high rises on these narrow barrier islands, which are susceptible to catastrophic damage from storms. Well, all of those homeowners are homeowners, first of all, and they all have homeowners insurance. So when their properties are damaged, they don't pay for the damage. We do as taxpayers. This is not the same for a lot of more vulnerable communities on coastal areas. And there's even actually substantial intersection between vulnerable chemical facilities on these coastal areas. These are facilities that can be damaged by extreme storms and have been damaged. And their potential then, and they're often co-located with these lower income communities because, of course, if you're wealthier, you don't want to live next to a chemical refinery. Well, this intersection between increased impacts from hurricanes and storm surges from hurricanes and this precarious set of industrial facilities along, let's say, the Gulf Coast, and then the communities right beside them is another classic example of environmental injustice related to climate change. But we can even come closer to home, and right here in Indiana, right here, in fact, where I am in Indianapolis, and you will see that our stormwater systems have had to be undergoing a massive rebuild because they wash raw sewage into a lot of our surface waterways, even when you have as little as 1/4 inch of rainfall. And it's very clear that the density of the sewer outlets, they're called combined sewer overflows or CSOs, are much higher in areas of lower income. And the reason I'm bringing this point up is that extreme rainfall events, which have already increased since about 1990 by about 15%. These are the ones that cause massive flooding, for example. They've increased over the last 40 years by about 15%. And climate models show they will continue to increase by about the same amount in the next 40 years. Well, what that does is make these CSOs much more likely to release again sewage into waterways, and even with the infrastructure, the massive project to divert some of these CSOs, it will be fighting against the impacts of climate change. Finally, an issue in urban areas that we've covered and studied quite a bit is extreme heat. And extreme heat there's some vulnerable populations, those who tend to be elderly and children and those with pre-existing conditions. They're very vulnerable to heat waves that last for more than a day or two. And the number of these heat waves are increasing, especially in cities. Now, cities have this urban heat island effect, so that they are hotter than the rural backgrounds. And this can be alleviated by having a higher amount of green density. So trees, for example. Urban forests are significantly cooler than the urban areas right across the street where there are no forest cover. And the work of Keeping Indianapolis Beautiful and us have been highlighting the inequality in communities. Low-income communities tend to have much lower greening than do higher-income communities. and Keeping Indianapolis Beautiful and Citizens Utilities are working hard to counteract that by strategic tree planting. We can't necessarily plant our way out of all of these problems, but that's certainly an example of a solution to climate injustice, at least, to relieve some of the burdens that lower income communities in cities at least face. So I'd like to wrap this up by noting that the Environmental Resilience Institute and the work of a lot of the researchers have been for years focused on some of these issues. And it's only become even more imperative with the racial protests that we've had this year in recognition of the widespread awareness that racism is still a key component of the American story. It's only become more obvious that we need to work much harder on some of these environmental injustice issues, particularly related to climate change. Thank you very much.